also just as a simple indicator to you that as professional economists, they've looked at many of these things, they've tried to create indicators, which may be more sensitive to a range of policy prescriptions, and they have some tentative conclusions. And particularly in the area of basic stuff, which is basic education and basic health, going by the Sen, Usman capability approach, there seems to be a clear preference in Professor Ehsan's thing towards public funding and public running. I mean, he's not got into how you run these well, but what he's saying quite clearly is that if the state tends to step back from the kind of necessary commitments that it needs to make, and therefore looks for either private funding or insurance funding in the case of health, etc., the outcomes from any human rights or any human development perspective are not likely to be good. Is that a reasonable summary?
That's regulation, yes, thank you. Yes. Thank you. Very well done. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It will be a difficult act to follow the two professors, but I'll give it a shot from a very non-economic perspective. What I'll try and do is talk about human development as understood as a very narrowly defined bureaucratic term, and that's because my work is on bureaucracies and in particular the Indian Foreign Service and Administrative Service. To talk about a sort of conceptualization of human development, how it chimes with the people who actually implement policy and how it doesn't, and to show why it chimes. The main issues, as it strikes me, as would have come out in my talk, but which I will truncate, is the idea of wealth and ownership of wealth. This seems to be problematic for a lot of the Indian civil servants that I did my field work with, who are now about 10 years into their career. And but at the same time, while there is this ontological problem about the idea of wealth, there is also a lot of chiming at a more surface level of what actually human development ought to be. And then that raises the question, if there is so much chiming amongst Indians civil servants, foreign service officers, IAS officers, mid-career people, then why does so little get done on the ground? And I will not offer my own answers to this, but I would rather let my sources do the talking. So I was going to start with a sort of history of human development, which I won't really go into now, but what I think is of importance is the idea of wealth as being something that is owned or generated by individuals, that has been sort of translated as something sort of as something entrenched in people, and how to realize this. So what is of relevance, I think, is the broad concept of human development, which has largely remained static, and it has to do with wealth conceived broadly. As I said, there are, of course, problems with the ontology of wealth, which is that wealth is a divisive concept, quite alien to many Indians until quite recently, including people who are IAS and IFS officers today. So given the problematics of the word wealth, I think we could instead use the term freedom, and this was actually suggested to me by an IAS officer. And these freedoms, and once again, this is my categorization, inspired by someone else, but my categorization, can be broadly understood as the freedom of capital, the freedom of movement, the freedom to be political, and the freedom to be social. Nevertheless, wealth is a founding assumption, and as such does have the benefit because it focuses the mind on the recurring role of capital in delivering the freedoms in the various realms that I just mentioned, which is social, political, mobility, and of course capital in itself. The manner in which it seems to me that these four broadly conceptualized categories translate into the Indian context is to begin with capital, the freedom to generate and then move capital anywhere around the globe, for mobility to be able to travel around the globe, to be able to practice politics as one chooses, and finally conduct one's social life in the manner one would like to. Underscoring nearly all of these is, of course, capital. To illustrate what I mean, here are some examples. The ability to earn and move monies overseas is not possible for many in India because of social norms that limit certain people professionally and state-imposed limitations on the sending of and receiving of capital from overseas.
Next is the inability of Indians to travel because they are subjected to oppressive visa regimes, not because they are stringent, but because they are arbitrary. The third freedom of being political without fear is patently curtailed in practice, as some recent political deaths illustrate. And the final ability to be social as one chooses is also curtailed by dispersed social movements and those seeking to restrict, for instance, certain forms of marriage. While these are the actual forms whereby freedom is limited in India, the question, of course, arises, where does the power and responsibility to enhance these freedoms lie? There are two possibilities, national and international as I see it, by which in particular I mean the developed world and India. On capital, the onus is entirely on the Indian state, for foreign governments are quite willing to accept flows of Indian capital and would like Indian restrictions on the flow of foreign capital into India to be lifted. On the freedom of movement, the duty clearly lies with the rest of the world because they curtail a highly mobile population from traveling. As for political freedoms, the burden is probably almost exclusively on Indians, and the same could probably also be said about social freedoms. Nevertheless, and to reiterate, with the exception of the freedom of movement, the other three freedoms are to a great extent contingent on the international community and various economic factors. That is because they can raise the capital most effectively to enhance these freedoms. For the last part of my talk, I realize we should be going into questions now. I shall not dwell on the international community and its perspectives on Indian human development, nor shall I dwell upon the official renditions of the Indian state about United Nations initiatives. For that one can peruse official documents. Rather, let me turn to the data set of my fieldwork within the Indian bureaucracy and what they think and say about the four freedoms that I say compose human development. The reasons for dwelling on this class's perspective is because not only are they the gatekeepers of the mass of Indians beyond the workings of capital, but they also enact policy. These officials also frequently come from the very milieu that is the target for human development. And they interact, of course, with the politicians who ultimately make policy decisions, especially when it comes to matters pertaining to the United Nations. What the data shows is that at the level of personal opinions held by Indian civil servants, there is much alignment with the concept of human development. However, the complementarity of thought is belied by a lack of self-confessed failure to deliver on the ground. In short, the Indians in charge of developing human freedoms agree with human development conceptually and even practically to a certain extent, but nevertheless, surprisingly little is being achieved in actually improving or delivering these freedoms. What it suggests then is a mismatch somewhere in the apparatus of government, and closing it is, of course, vital. The manner of this mismatch can be evident through one example which I'll give. What a serving Indian official to a UN agency calls grandstanding. He explained that his job was to achieve at the broadest level human development goals, but at the grandiose level of international agreements. Whereas much more pressing for someone like him in particular was the need to deliver such freedoms immediately and directly. The freedom in particular this official was talking about was to set up a school in his village. And he was contrasting this with what he wanted to do with what he was actually doing, which was trying to negotiate India's place in the nuclear suppliers group. Now, of course, that nuclear suppliers group has a role in human development, but what his point is that his energies were being diverted through very circuitous routes to get human development rather than what he could have done directly and immediately. The final aspect I would like to talk about is one that underpins human development in India, and that is the making of assessments about what ought to be developed. These assessments arise from a group of people who are quite different from the very people who have been quoted who formulate human development as a concept. The difference lies in that these officials are, as I've mentioned, frequently from the very milieu that is the target for human development, or for the most acute requirements of human development. This means that conceptualizations are quite often different, particularly about the question arising from wealth, that is, of ownership. Often the belief is in communal ownership rather than private property, which is complicating for the element that is a freedom in itself and underscores the other freedoms relating to mobility, politics, and social norms. I'm talking about, of course, the role of capital and private capital in particular. In short, the mismatch between human development and practitioners is at a very deep conceptual level, the idea of wealth as being held privately. Nevertheless, the thinking of civil servants, more often than not, matches human development ideas at more evident levels of analysis. To illustrate why, let me close with the biography of an Indian diplomat, the person who I quoted earlier, who's negotiating India's nuclear treaties. Since we're out of time, I'll just bullet point this. This person, the reason why it chimes what we talk about in theory as human development, why it chimes with this official, is because he himself was born in the 1980s. He was on the global poverty index of surviving on $1 a day. What does that mean for a person to survive on $1 a day? In this person's case, it meant abjuring luxuries. So I asked him, what does luxury mean? It meant for him traveling by bus. So he walked. He had to change schools 6 times because the first 3 schools just existed on paper. And then the next 2 schools didn't teach the subjects that it was supposed to be teaching because there were no teachers. The only way he was able to get into the civil services is by getting a form for which he had to quit his job and travel to his hometown to collect that form and arrange for a loan from a bank because he had to quit his job to study for the civil services. It wasn't actually his intention to quit his job, but just so events transpired as such that he was fired from his job. So my point of showing this is that whilst there might be a deep mismatch in the idea of human development with the people in India who are actually going about trying to implement it and will be for the next 20 odd years, there is a great deal of matching at the objectives of human development. The other interesting thing that I will close with is that the kind of people in India who are actually conducting these assessments from within government and putting policies into practice are quite different from the people who developed the idea of human development itself, in that they were not raised in cities, they are not part of a transnational elite, they are not globalized citizens. But I think that is one route to development, but the other route, I personally think, is a much more inclusive route to development, because the people who are actually practicing it, putting it into effect, are the ones who actually are benefiting from those changes that they're putting into effect. In other words, they have a much greater understanding of what the situation is on the ground and perhaps serve as a useful connect to the globalized elite. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. I must say that some of your, if I understood your conclusions correctly, came to me as a huge surprise. I mean, if one was to talk in terms of the IFS or the IAS bureaucracy and see them as part of a relatively deprived set, who therefore agree with the normative goals of human rights and human development, and feel extremely frustrated about the fact that while they spend a lot of their energy in getting all these nice little things up on paper and in international negotiations, see very little of it actually translating it into the ground. I'm saying this would come to me as a huge surprise. Just as our common perceptions of the Indian bureaucracy about them at the IAS and at the IFS level as distinct from maybe provincial civil service or people serving in the under the 73rd or the 74th Amendment. is that increasingly, despite whatever is called the OBCization of the Indian bureaucracy, the entitlement levels of those who get into many of these positions are in fact quite substantial. Many of them have aspirations for vastly escalating it. I mean, every study done on the Missouri Academy and in terms of what the aspirations of those who are getting trained there comes as a huge shock to those of us who grew up in the 50s and the 60s under what are called funny Nehruvian or Lal Bahadur Shastri kind of rhetorics in terms of what we ought to do and what we have to aspire to. The ease with which they are willing to fiddle and faddle with rules for self-aggrandizement is, again, to people of my generation, come as a huge surprise. So if in fact we actually have substantial section, I'm not even interested in the word majority, but substantial sections of our policy implementing apparatus at middle management or higher levels, who in value terms seem to be attuned to many of these goals, that would actually be a dramatic validation of India's constitutional promises. All right. Then one could ask a separate question, that why, despite the fact that you actually have an implementing set, which is so much more committed to these sets of things, that we are still unable to do so. And that would get us into a very different kind of sociological orientation. But that apart, that's my personal surprise, and I'm, usually enlightened by the fact that you actually, because you did detailed interviews with many of these people, you can get things that maybe many of us are prejudiced with respect to whatever we read. We have about 20 odd minutes, and like everyone says, this is for the university, so instead of having an in-house discussion with those of us who come from outside, if there are students who want to quiz all these learned panelists and interlocutors about what they are saying and want to take the debate forward, please. Short and sharp will be better. Come.
I have a question for Mr. Rajiv. You mentioned that economic policy needs to be more heterodoxical, and that it needs to be anchored with a normative aspect, and the way to go about it is by bridging the language of human rights and using the language in policy decisions. But you also mentioned that there needs to be a realist aspect to policy making. So merely leaving the discourse at saying that, well, bridging the language of human rights into policy making would not, in my opinion, be a very realist approach to this policy making. So then what otherwise would you suggest in a realist term to help facilitate this difference between the inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity that we face?
Well, let's see if we can get a few more. I'm surprised that none of you are vastly agitated by these very learned presentations. I'm sure you'll come up with something or the other. So shall we let Rajiv get himself into a deeper hole by...
Okay, thank you for the question. Thank you very much. See, one part is to getting the toolkits in place which allows you to make policies policies that are embedded in a normative notions that you prescribe to, that the society prescribes to. So one part is about getting the toolkit in place and then crafting those policies. That part is not too difficult. We can, of course it's not perfect. We are working with tools, we are developing indicators, and once a right sensitive indicator is integrated into the policy, and the integration could take place at several levels, in the agenda setting for the policy, Okay, I want to get rid of poverty. So there it translates into a number which could be the goal for the policy over a particular span of time. Indicators also come in actual, there could be different kinds of indicators. I talk of indicators which capture a process to see how, to what extent is the process on track. The things, development is not a one-shot exercise. You know, it has to go on. New people are coming in, some are moving out, some are going over the poverty line and so on and so forth. So it is a process, and you have to ensure that the process is embedded in the desired social norms that the society subscribes to or agrees on, and that the process goes on indefinitely till there is life. So that part can be, but the realistic part I was referring to was in terms of the resource availability. We can't, as much as I would like to get rid of poverty tonight, I can't. Much as I would like to get rid of hunger or get rid of illiteracy or ill health, I can't. So the point I was trying to make is there is an absolutist notion of rights, that rights have been guaranteed and they must be met with the suitable complement of goods and services that allow you to realize those rights. And that will have to be done in many instances. In certain contexts, that has to be the approach. You create entitlements, legal entitlements for certain resources, which then allows the people to move on. But in many instances, we can't afford to just proliferate this whole line of thinking, not keeping an eye on what the resources are. And that's where the macro context comes in. The point is that the sustainability of the process would encourage you, or should encourage you to be more realistic about where you draw your lines and what kind of tools you use. So that's the thing I was mentioning. I mean, it can be nuanced and one can elaborate on it, but I'll leave it at that right now. But certainly we need a purposeful direction for the policy, and the purpose has to come from social concerns, and in response to social concerns, and in response to what is socially seen as the end, and one has to find various modalities to walk on that path. And one of them, and in many areas it could be the option, is to create entitlement, but there are other ways of working. And that's what I was alluding to.
Rajiv, can I push you a little bit into this?
Not too much, but
No,
yes.
no. I mean, I'm very sort of, concerned with.
But you could also, I take the liberty of saying, you could also push the chair into getting you into responding to some of these questions.
I'm trying to do it through this particular. For instance, this business of our policies being driven by a set of, he said, social concerns and shared norms. Now, let's take something which has been talked about a lot in the morning, which is right to education. We've also talked about inclusive education, not just right to education for all up till class, whatever it is, and but inclusive education. Now, is inclusive education a shared social norm? I mean, what does one do in situations where, in fact, many of the things which you derive from a more abstract understanding of human rights, all individuals, irrespective of their caste, creed, color, you use constitution, you use this, that, have to be treated at par. But that's not your social reality. That is also not your social consensus. And not just social consensus in terms of the fact that I disapprove or dislike of it, but in many places I actively work against it. So I can appoint for my midday meal schemes people who will dispense food who come from the Dalit communities. And the students might walk out, their parents will object, that your policy will come in sharp contrast with the fact that the local parent-teacher association ought to be an important oversight body in the running of the school. After all, it's their children. What does one do in situations with this particular variety? I mean, those are at the ground level the kind of concerns within which we often see that we have policy pronouncements and we have entitlements made, which we then hope somehow to catch up. And we expect that because we made these entitlements, because we've shoved them into law, because we've done all of this, that there will be some sort of restraint. So you're also seeking to modulate social behavior and social norms and create. I mean, just as you said that many of these things are a process, I think it's critical for us to conceptually understand that both state and nation making as well as society making is a continuous process. This is something that you work both from below in terms of social pressure and norms and struggles and conflicts and fights, as also from the top. I mean, the only reason that people today remember Nehru is for the lovely evocative letters that he wrote to the chief minister saying, good guys, we all fought together, please you must do the following sets of things, which may appear anachronistic at one level, but you think of it in the context of the early 50s, where you're trying to push a country through a set of nudging exercises by the highest executive authority in the state. I'm saying that's how norms get built, and that's how many of these exercises work out. I mean, sometimes well, often badly. That's some sort of an answer. Yes.
My question is to Mr. Sethi.
But I mean, no. I'm only interlocutor.
No. I just want you to elaborate on the point which in which you pointed out the dichotomy between the aspirations of the civil servants in context of the study you mentioned about done on the Missouri Institute and the possible ramifications of that in terms of the generational divide seen in the aspirations of the civil servants. Could you shed a little light on that?
No, I mean, the actual empirical work has been done by Professor Das.
No,
right?
I wanted an elaboration on that so that he could possibly respond to that.
No, I'm saying I was only going by the fact, I mean, what is our perception, for instance, of, see, I mean, we don't have a Dalit activist here at the moment, or maybe we have, I don't know. Ask, no, proper, all right. I mean, what is the nature of the critique? The nature of the critique is that even despite constitutional reservations and things of this variety and the Supreme Court passing, for class 3 position, for class 4 positions, you have SC/ST requirements which are met legally. Sometimes for class 1, because the numbers are very small and the gaze is very high, so everybody is keeping a track of it. But when you look at class 2 and class 3, then you have huge, what you would call leakages, that if you're supposed to have 30%, you actually have only 4. In places which teach all these things, take Delhi University. Delhi University has been in violation of constitutional guidelines for the last 60 years in terms of both students and teachers and the appointment to all of it. I mean, so have many of our other institutions. So the perception from the ground level by a Dalit activist is that the instrumentalities of the state have actually been captured by a set of characters, all right? Which in their perception is a good enough reason to understand why many of the pronouncements made, many of the nice gestures made to them, all the political slogans do not work in practice. I mean, that's the analytics that they offer. Now, is that correct? Is that wrong? Is it changing? Is it not changing? Has it become more stultified? Has it become less stultified? Are we a more responsive society? Are we a more responsive state administration? Are matters for studies like the one that Professor Dasgupta does, and that is what helps us change our perceptions. Otherwise, we grow up with some ideas, and if there's nothing else, then we don't stick to it. And I'm saying this is a question that you ask him. It to me came as a surprise, and therefore if it is true, I'm really very thrilled. So,
I think, thank you for that, Mr. Sethi. What you say is completely correct, but two things have happened. One is the ideas of Nehru have become such a norm that they're not even associated with the name Nehru anymore. The idea of ownership, wealth, for a lot of these people who are civil servants today, including Dalits, wealth is not been traditionally a question of private ownership, and even in their lives it has not been a question of private ownership, because it has been the state that has given them everything. So in these ways, in these multitude of ways, the idea of Nehruvian India is really ingrained in them. And when they choose to act against it, what they're acting, they will even frame their comments as acting against Nehruvian India. I of course did say that there might be a commonality, but there is very little deliverance on the ground. What is the issue with the deliverance? The issue with the deliverance is, of course, to a large section, to a large part, what Mr. Sethi said, that a certain group of characters has managed to capture the state and its pronouncements. But that is undoubtedly there. But what I'm talking about is that they are serving their own particular interest, but there is also another set of interests that are at play. I mean, I tacitly recognize that point in saying that why is there this failure of delivery when there is this matching of interests?
Sudarshan. And no, Maya person.
And I'm fascinated by your study, and I will really, really enjoy reading it. My question would be then, why do they give you an answer about why they are not delivering it? Beyond saying that I was posted in the wrong place or my expertise is not being given. Because I work a great deal with another set of state agents, which is the police. And I hear them say all of those lovely things about upholding the law, being righteous, taking care of the poor, protecting forever, and all of that, and then beating the hell out of people, torturing them, killing them, with not a hair turned.
Yes.
So this dichotomy or this ambivalence of morality, I wonder whether you have been able to capture that. I would be really interested in understanding it, because one of the things that they are extremely comfortable with is not delivering on their mandate.
Yes, on the way in which one really gets to know and one does field work is not really through interviews, but by getting drunk with. That's what Indian civil service is like. So, pint glasses mixed with all sorts of drinks, and you talk. One day, there was a revenue service officer who wanted to be posted to Bombay, young chap, probationer, 8 years ago. We left the party, and IFS officer asked me, what did you think of him? I said, he seemed very committed, and the IFS chap laughed at me and he said, you think he wants to get posted to Bombay because he's committed? He wants to get posted to Bombay because he can make money. And then the IFS probationer said that, it's all right to make something for yourself, but also do something for the country.
So no.
There is that element. I'm saying that they're not devoid of morality. They very much have a sense of morality, and that morality is pegged to the norm of Nehruvian India. Another fellow, a revenue service officer in Mussoorie, one day over breakfast, told me in Hindi that he would screw anyone earning over 2 or 3 crores, and various other colorful language. And before I could say anything, he said to me in Hindi again, Deep, what do you think of me now? See, that is morality. They're not devoid of morality. At the very least, one cannot say that they're devoid of morality. That they are acting immorally, sure. They have the choice to do so, but they're just not acting in a moral vacuum. They're quite aware of transgressions. And at the same time, I think that poses a burden on them as well, the transgressions. The reasons for their committing these transgressions can be multiple. This revenue service officer explained to me the way in which he understood the entire state. This bunch of people that Mr. Sethi pointed out who have captured the state, they see themselves as revolutionaries. They see the city globalized elite as the ones who have captured the state, and they want to take it back. And in taking it back, they are willing to, in some ways, act immorally.
The chair is full, so I will.
Sudarshan, you had.
No, I just wanted to make a comment provoked by what Rajiv said, because we are a kind of a university where the law school has been deliberately placed in juxtaposition with other schools, unlike the way in which the National Law School of India, Bangalore, started and put law on as a respectable profession or course of studies. I wanted to connect that the fact of what's possible, in the sense that you said that in terms of the ships that pass by in the night, the human rights community, which is mostly populated with lawyers, and the policy community, which is mostly populated by economists, that we need to find a common language. And what you're proposing is that if we had some indicators that have been consciously drawn up, which connect with the discourse on human rights and the analysis that economists would undertake, that's one way of making the connection. But it seems to me there's a more fundamental issue in terms of the discourse, in the sense that, or by training and habit, lawyers and judges, when you have a set of rights and you have a norm that everybody is equal under the law, the tendency is to think in terms of either everybody has those rights or none has. So if you then, whereas for the policymakers and politicians, the world is not in terms of all or nothing or black and white. It's more, in terms of more or less. So you say the tenant who tills the land deserves more of a right to property, and the zamindar who's exploited him for decades should have little or no right to property. Now that idea is simply not translatable when it comes to the discourse of lawyers and judges, when you have a right to property guaranteed to everybody under the Constitution. So then the judges and the lawyers would say, yes, there is a right, and it doesn't matter who it is, who are the parties before the court, this is how we administer the law. So we need to do a lot more work in terms of how to create not simply, and within the law, of course, you have, black letter lawyers who are pretty awful in terms of sticking to what's written there. But you also have, lawyers, judges like Bhagwati and Krishna here, who try to say our constitution has a programmatic purpose, there's a teleology to it, and we must interpret provisions informed by that. Or you may say, some others may be very creative and say we will stay within the framework of the law, but use some interpretations like Subbarao did to say Article 13 of the Constitution says none of the provisions of no law in the country would be valid if it violated the provisions of Part 3, fundamental rights. And he held that the word law there includes a constitutional amendment. Now that's a kind of creative interpretation. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to have more a conscious effort at a discourse where we get this understanding of what is it that the policymaker is trying to say. Because we are now in a situation where it is not simply at some stratospheric level Phil Alston saying that there's no communication or no lack of understanding. But it seems like every policy can be, in this country now, be stumped and stymied by going to court. And the big thing that happens is that the status quo always is privileged, because you can get a stay until the court has deliberated the matter and so on. Things will remain as they are. And whereas the policy effort must be to change the way things are, change the status quo. So I think this is a serious purpose. I mean, in the sense that I'm saying that what it triggers is not simply that you could have some indicators, but then there should be a lot more communication, understanding of the way politicians and policymakers think about the world and the way fundamental rights judges think about it. And so what the university ought to do, if it is to live up to the belief that locating a law school alongside other schools that work on other social sciences, is to produce a kind of generation of lawyers, thinkers and judges who are different from what we've had till now.
As they say, I have this extremely pleasant duty to say thank you all, and you can have your tea and whatever. I hope that whatever torpor or sleep you had after your heavy meal, we managed to handle. Thank you very much.